By late 1941, Royal Air Force pilots were climbing into their Spitfires, knowing they were outclassed. The new German Focke-Wulf 190 dominated them in speed, climb rate, and firepower. But the real killer was altitude. Above 20,000 feet, the Spitfire's engine gasped for oxygen, while German fighters soared effortlessly. The Luftwaffe was on the brink of defeating Britain, and without a solution, invasion would follow. The physics seemed impossible. Thin air meant less oxygen, less power. But at Rolls-Royce, Stanley Hooker, an engineer who thought in equations rather than intuition, was about to prove that mathematics could rewrite the rules of aerial combat. But what made one engineer's mathematics more valuable than a squadron of fighters? The answer was written in the sky over the English Channel. August 1941. Flight Lieutenant James McLaughlin of 603 Squadron pushes his throttle forward over the English Channel. His Spitfire Mark V climbs toward 20,000 feet, chasing a Focke-Wulf 190 that appeared moments ago. The German fighter pulls away effortlessly. McLaughlin's Merlin engine screams, but the thin air starves it. Above 20,000 feet, his aircraft becomes sluggish. The FW-190 climbs higher, turns, and dives back toward him with terrifying speed. McLaughlin has no choice but to break off and run for the coast. By November, 3 months after the FW-190's arrival, Fighter Command had lost so many aircraft that daylight operations over France were suspended. The numbers told a grim story. The German fighter was 25 to 30 miles per hour faster at 2,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, the gap widened. It climbed faster, rolled faster, and hit harder with 4 20mm cannons. Wing Commander Johnny Johnson, who had become the RAF's highest-scoring ace, watched his squadrons bleed. "They drove us back to the coast," he wrote. The Luftwaffe was winning the altitude war, and without a solution, Britain's skies would belong to Germany. But this wasn't about courage or tactics, it was physics. At 30,000 feet, air pressure drops to less than a third of sea level. The Spitfire's Merlin engine, brilliant at low altitude, was suffocating. The single-stage supercharger that compressed air into the cylinders simply couldn't force enough oxygen through thin atmosphere. German fighters, equipped with better high-altitude systems, owned the sky above 20,000 feet, and in aerial combat, altitude is life. He who flies highest shoots first. The Air Ministry knew the war could be lost in the stratosphere. They pressed Rolls-Royce for answers. The company's engineers tried everything. Bigger impellers, stronger materials, higher gear ratios, nothing worked. The supercharger had reached its physical limits. But inside the experimental department at Derby, a solution was already forming, though almost no one recognized it yet. 3 years earlier, in January 1938, a 30-year-old mathematician named Stanley Hooker had walked into Ernest Hives' office for a job interview. Hives, who ran Rolls-Royce's Aero Engine division, looked at Hooker's academic papers. Doctorate from Oxford, research on fluid dynamics, theoretical aerodynamics. Hives leaned back in his chair. "You're not much of an engineer, are you?" Hooker admitted he wasn't, at least not in the traditional sense. He had never built an engine, but he had spent years at the Admiralty calculating airflow patterns that perhaps 200 people in the world could understand. So Hives took a chance and hired him. Rolls-Royce needed fresh thinking, even if it came from a man who thought in equations rather than metal. Hooker's first days at Derby were bewildering. He was shown to a small office, a desk, a telephone, an empty bookshelf, no instructions, no assignments. He sat there for 2 days reading the Times while the factory roared around him. On the third day, he walked out into the drafting rooms where young engineers hunched over technical drawings. In the corner sat a quiet older man surrounded by test data. Hooker asked what he did. "Supercharger testing," the man said. He showed Hooker sheets of numbers, pressure readings, airflow measurements, temperature curves. To most engineers, it was raw data. To Hooker, it was a language he understood perfectly. He took the data back to his office and began calculating. What he found would change everything. The numbers revealed a problem that Rolls-Royce's best engineers had walked past for years. To understand what Hooker saw, you first need to understand what happens to an engine at altitude. At sea level, atmospheric pressure pushes down with 14 pounds per square inch. The air is dense, rich with oxygen. An engine breathes easily. But climb to 30,000 feet and the pressure drops to less than a third. The air becomes thin, sparse. An engine that roars with 1,000 horsepower on the ground gasps and wheezes in the stratosphere. It's like trying to breathe through a straw at the top of Everest. No amount of throttle can force oxygen that isn't there. The solution was a supercharger. A centrifugal compressor bolted to the engine, driven by gears connected to the crankshaft. At its heart sat a spinning disc called an impeller, roughly 10 inches in diameter, rotating at enormous speed. Air entered the centre and was flung outward by centrifugal force, compressed, then fed into the engine's cylinders. At low and medium altitudes, it worked beautifully. The Merlin could maintain power up to 16,000 feet. But above that, even the supercharger began to struggle. The impeller could only spin so fast before the metal tore itself apart. By 20,000 feet, the air was simply too thin for a single stage of compression to make up the difference. Hooker sat in his office at Derby, surrounded by test data, pressure readings, temperature curves, airflow measurements. He began calculating. Where others saw acceptable performance, Hooker saw catastrophic waste. The supercharger was operating at roughly 65 to 68% efficiency. That meant 35% of the energy used to spin the impeller was being lost. Not to mechanical friction, but to something invisible. Turbulence. Disrupted airflow. Wasted motion. He requested the engineering drawings. When they arrived, he understood immediately. The air intake that fed the supercharger was cramped, squashed into the side of the engine. Air had to make a sharp 90-degree turn before entering the impeller. It was forced through 6 separate openings that disrupted the smooth passage of flow. To a practical engineer who had built engines for decades, this was simply how it was done. To a mathematician trained in fluid dynamics, it was a disaster. Air doesn't like to be forced around corners. Every sharp turn creates eddies, vortices, chaos. Energy that should compress air was instead being converted into heat and noise. Hooker's colleagues at Derby watched him fill notebooks with equations. Some were sceptical. What does calculus have to do with metal and oil? Veteran engineers trusted experience, intuition, the feel of a machine under test. Hooker trusted mathematics. He could see what they couldn't. The invisible rivers of air flowing through the supercharger, the precise angles where flow separated from metal surfaces, the exact points where energy bled away into turbulence. He had spent years at the Admiralty studying these patterns. Now he was applying that knowledge to a machine that could decide the fate of Britain. But proving his theory would require something Rolls-Royce had never attempted: redesigning the supercharger from first principles, using mathematics instead of trial and error. Hooker began with the intake. He designed a smooth central entry system. Air would flow directly into the centre of the impeller without sharp turns or obstructions. He recalculated the angles of the guide vanes that directed air onto the spinning disc. He reshaped the diffuser that slowed the compressed air before it entered the engine. The new intake created a distinctive bulge at the rear of the engine housing. The factory workers, with typical British irreverence, nicknamed it the baby's bum. The name stuck, but what mattered was what the numbers showed. The redesigned supercharger pushed efficiency from 65% to 76%. 11 percentage points translated directly into power. The Merlin 45, fitted with Hooker's improved single-stage supercharger, delivered 1,515 horsepower at 11,000 feet. It was a 30% increase from earlier variants. The improvement went into production Spitfire Mark V's by early 1941. But in August 1941, the Focke-Wulf 190 appeared over France, and everything changed. In October, Spitfire Mark Vs of 452 Squadron engaged FW-190s over the Channel. Despite Hooker's improvements, the German fighters climbed above them and attacked from altitude with impunity. The RAF lost 3 aircraft. The FW-190s escaped untouched. The single-stage supercharger, even at 76% efficiency, simply couldn't compress enough thin air above 20,000 feet. Hooker's first breakthrough had bought time, but it wasn't enough. The Air Ministry made their demand clear. They needed full combat power at 40,000 feet. The solution seemed obvious. If one supercharger stage couldn't compress the air sufficiently, use 2. Compress it once, then compress it again. But the physics were brutal. Compression generates heat. A single-stage supercharger already raised intake air temperature significantly. Adding a second stage pushed temperatures to 200 degrees Celsius, 400 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, the fuel-air mixture didn't wait for the spark plug. It ignited spontaneously the moment it entered the cylinder. Pre-ignition. The uncontrolled explosion would hammer pistons from the wrong direction, cracking metal, bending connecting rods, destroying the engine from the inside. Every test of 2-stage compression without cooling ended in catastrophic failure. Across the Atlantic, American engineers have found a different path. They used turbochargers, devices powered by exhaust gases rather than the engine's crankshaft. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning and Republic P-47 Thunderbolt both achieved excellent high-altitude performance this way. But turbocharging required extensive ducting to route exhaust gases to the turbine and compressed air back to the engine. It needed intercoolers, wastegates, complex control systems. The P-47, built around its massive turbocharger installation, was one of the largest and heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. The Spitfire was different. It was small, light, designed around the compact elegance of the Merlin. There was simply no room in that slender fuselage for the bulky plumbing that turbocharging required. Hooker needed another solution. Hooker then designed a second independent cooling circuit dedicated entirely to the intercooler. Hot, compressed air leaving the first supercharger stage would pass through a heat exchanger built directly into the supercharger housing itself. Coolant would flow through passages cast into the metal, absorbing the heat and carrying it away to a small dedicated radiator mounted in the starboard wing. It was, in engineering terms, a plumbing nightmare. The system required its own water pump, its own header tank, its own radiator, its own network of hoses and connections. It added weight, it added complexity, it added dozens of potential failure points, but it worked. The intercooler dropped the temperature of the compressed intake air from 200 degrees Celsius to approximately 60 degrees, a 140-degree reduction. The air entering the engine cylinders was now dense, cool, and stable. No pre-ignition, no detonation, no melting pistons. What made Hooker's solution remarkable was that nobody else managed to replicate it. The Americans had their turbochargers, the Germans had their own supercharger designs, but a compact liquid-cooled intercooler integrated directly into a 2-stage gear-driven supercharger, fitted into a small single-engine fighter, this was unique. No other nation fielded anything comparable during the entire war. March 1942. The first production Merlin 61 roared to life on the test stand at Derby. 1,565 horsepower at 12,250 feet. 1,390 horsepower at 23,500 feet. At 30,000 feet, where the original Merlin produced barely 500 horsepower, the Merlin 61 delivered over 1,000, a full doubling of high-altitude power. Test pilot Geoffrey Quill flew the prototype and described it as a quantum leap over existing fighters. But there was a problem. The purpose-built Spitfire Mark 8, designed specifically around the 2-stage Merlin, wouldn't enter production until late 1942. Fighter Command couldn't wait that long. RAF pilots were dying now, outclassed by German fighters that owned the sky above 20,000 feet. The solution was desperate. take existing Spitfire Mark V airframes and adapt them to accept the two-stage engine. The conversion required surgical precision. The Merlin 61's increased length demanded new engine cowlings. 4-bladed propellers replaced 3-blade units to handle the increased power. 2 thermostatically controlled radiators managed the complex cooling requirements. Every modification fought against time, while German air superiority solidified. The aircraft that emerged was designated the Spitfire Mark IX. It was not a new design. It was a proven airframe with a revolutionary engine bolted into it, sent into combat because waiting for perfection would cost too many lives. The first production Mark IXs arrived at RAF Hornchurch in June 1942. Externally, they looked identical to the Mark V. German pilots wouldn't know what hit them until it was too late. July 30th, 1942. 9 Focke-Wulf 190s encountered 12 Spitfire Mark IXs during a sweep over Saint-Omer. The German formation, expecting to dictate engagement terms as usual, found itself meeting fighters that climbed, accelerated, and manoeuvred at high altitude with unprecedented effectiveness. In the swirling dogfight that followed, 5 FW-190s fell to Spitfire guns. The RAF lost no aircraft. German pilots returned to base shaken. Oberst Adolf Galland reviewed the combat reports with alarm. Some Spitfires, externally identical to earlier marks, were matching FW-190 performance at altitude. The tactical advantage had evaporated overnight. Wing Commander Alan Deere, flying the new variant, reported that at 21,000 feet, the Mark IX was approximately 30 miles per hour faster than the Focke-Wulf, better in the climb, and vastly more manoeuvrable. Johnny Johnson, who would finish the war as the RAF's highest-scoring ace, later wrote that fighter pilots of every nationality thought the Spitfire 9 was the best close-in fighter of them all. The altitude problem that had nearly cost Britain the war was solved. But Hooker's breakthrough would reshape more than just one battle. By the end of 1942, the Spitfire Mark IX equipped more squadrons than any other variant in the aircraft's history. It fought over North Africa, where RAF pilots discovered the 2-stage supercharger maintained power output despite reduced air density at high altitude and extreme temperatures. It flew over Sicily and Italy, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. On June 6, 1944, Spitfire Mark IXs provided air cover over the beaches of Normandy. The aircraft, intended as a desperate stopgap, a compromise born from crisis, became legendary. It remained in frontline service until the final days of the war in Europe. What Hooker had designed in a cramped office at Derby, filling notebooks with equations while his colleagues watched skeptically, had become the backbone of Allied air superiority. The Merlin engine's transformation was even more remarkable. In 1939, when Hooker first walked into Ernest Hive's office, the Merlin produced roughly 1,000 horsepower. By 1945, specialized variants were delivering over 2,000 horsepower. The power had doubled. Same cylinder block, same basic architecture, same 27-litre displacement. What changed was the understanding of how air behaved under compression, how heat could be managed, how efficiency could be extracted from invisible fluid dynamics. Hooker's 2-stage supercharger concept, refined through countless iterations, had unlocked potential that trial-and-error engineering could never have found. Over 165,000 Merlin engines rolled off production lines in Britain and America. It became the most successful aircraft power plant in history, powering not just Spitfires, but Hurricanes, Lancasters, Mosquitoes, and the American P-51 Mustang. By 1941, Hooker had risen to head Rolls-Royce's supercharger development division. Ernest Hives, the man who had looked at his academic papers and declared him not much of an engineer, now trusted him completely. The skepticism had evaporated, replaced by results that spoke louder than credentials. Hooker would go on to pioneer jet engine development after the war, helping create the engines that powered the Harrier jump jet and saving Rolls-Royce from financial collapse in the 1970s. He was knighted for his contributions to British engineering. But for decades, his wartime work remained classified. The public knew about the Spitfire, they knew about the Merlin, but almost no one knew about the mathematician who had made both of them dominant. In 1984, at the age of 77, Stanley Hooker published his autobiography. He could have chosen any title. He had shaped jet engines, saved a company, been honoured by the crown. Instead, he chose 5 words that Ernest Hives had spoken to him nearly half a century earlier. Not much of an engineer. It wasn't bitterness, it was a statement. Hives had been technically correct. Hooker was never a traditional engineer. He didn't trust experience or intuition or the feel of metal under stress. He trusted mathematics. He trusted measurement. He trusted that invisible patterns in airflow could be calculated, predicted, and optimized. That approach, so foreign to the practical men who built engines with their hands, had revolutionized an entire field. Test pilot Bill Bedford, when asked to name Britain's greatest engineer, said he would have to choose between Isambard Kingdom Brunel and Stanley Hooker, but he would probably choose Hooker. The principles Hooker proved didn't disappear with the end of piston-engine fighters. Every turbocharged engine today, whether in aircraft, automobiles, or industrial applications, uses the concepts he pioneered. 2-stage compression, intercooling, efficiency optimization through fluid dynamics. When you see the word turbocharged on a modern car, you're seeing the legacy of equations written in a Derby office in 1940. The liquid-cooled intercooler, the innovation that no other nation replicated during the war, is now standard in high-performance engines worldwide. Hooker didn't just solve the Spitfire's altitude problem. He created the mathematical framework for managing compressed air under extreme conditions. That framework became the foundation of modern forced induction. Hooker once said, "We measured what others assumed." That single sentence captured his entire philosophy. Progress doesn't come from doing things the way they've always been done. It doesn't come from trusting instinct or following convention. It comes from the discipline of measurement, from the courage to question accepted wisdom, from the belief that physics can be calculated even when everyone else insists it must be felt. The pilots who climbed into their Spitfires in 1941, knowing they were outclassed, would finish the war dominating the skies. Not because of bravery alone, but because one mathematician refused to accept that the laws of physics couldn't be calculated.